Ahoy! My name is Melany. Nintendo is very well known for being very litigious regarding their properties. Deep below the happy, bubbly faces, their iconic mascots, lies one of the most persistently uptight gaming corporations of all time. This is seen everywhere in the current state of Nintendo, being extremely litigious and going after emulation, shutting down fan games and projects, to being comically harsh towards pirates of their games. Nintendo is pretty infamous for making fans irate due to their increasingly harsh attitudes. This sort of behavior is most well known amongst the current age of Nintendo, namely the Nintendo DS era up to the current day. However, this behavior of the company is nothing new. Nintendo has always been incredibly uptight as a corporation, going all the way back to the NES era. People in the retro gaming scene love to romanticize the NES era, whether for nostalgia purposes or a belief that gaming was at a golden age at this time. However, this era isn't really as great as many like to remember it being. Today, I want to cover a handful of instances of Nintendo as a company pulling some scummy behavior in one form or another during the NES era, namely Nintendo's monopolistic practices within their licensee program. The NES was released at a weird time in gaming history. I'm pretty sure everyone and their fucking mom knows what this story is, but for those who don't know, Atari and other gaming corporations had effectively killed off the gaming industry due to a string of very low quality games on the market. You know, your ETs, your Pac-Man, so on and so forth. Consumers had a consistent issue of being unable to tell whether a game was something they actually wanted, or if it would be utter dog shit. When Nintendo released the NES, they had effectively revitalized the gaming industry. However, it seems Nintendo got drunk off their industry influence almost immediately. When it came to third-party developers making games for the NES, Nintendo adopted a very conservative market strategy, with the 1983 game crash being caused by an overabundance of games, with most of them barely being of any quality at insane prices. Nintendo really wanted to push an idea of quality over quantity in titles on the NES. They introduced the now iconic Nintendo Seal of Quality, which was intended to be used as a sign that the game for the NES was of some level of quality. However, for developers and publishers, this meant strict guidelines. If a publisher wanted to release a game on the NES, they would have to apply to be Nintendo licensees in order to officially release their games on the NES. This was mandatory in order to release a game on the console, as Nintendo implemented an authentication chip inside NES console and games, known as the 10NES chip. This was used as an effort by Nintendo to prevent developers and publishers from releasing games without Nintendo's license. Additionally, there were several conditions attached to licensees. All games had to be approved by Nintendo. If the game contained elements like swearing, excessive violence, religious symbols, sexually provocative material, or other suggestive elements, Nintendo wouldn't approve it and developers would have to censor it. Additionally, publishers could only buy cartridges directly from Nintendo and pay their prices, and the minimum cartridge order was 10,000 carts. Not only that, but publishers were limited to the strict limit of only be able to release 5 games per year. These are all really scummy guidelines enforced by Nintendo. This is a far cry compared to what we have now. You ever go into the Nintendo Switch recent releases section? They would let anything with a fucking title screen pass on here. But back then, they were so fucking stingy. These are all really scummy guidelines enforced by Nintendo. However, in my opinion, the worst clause in the licensee program was a rule that required all games released on the NES to remain exclusive to the platform for 2 years. Publishers could not release multi-platform titles whatsoever until 2 years after the NES release. Could you fucking imagine that? These clauses in the program were undoubtedly extremely monopolistic. Competing systems at the time, like the Sega Master System or Atari 7800, were basically doomed by this, as these consoles could definitely run most of the games on NES just fine for the most part in one form or another. But Nintendo was just not giving competing platforms a fair competition. I mean, just look at the amount of games released for the Atari 7800 and compare it to the massive list of games released on the NES. These platforms couldn't get any of the biggest games, so therefore people wouldn't buy these platforms, and in turn fewer games would be made for the console. Do you see what they were doing here? It was a monopolistic loop overseen by Nintendo from the very beginning. If Nintendo could legally get away with this sort of behavior now, I am almost certain they would. Very few multi-platform games existed on the NES while these rules were in place. And honestly, in my opinion, I feel like this monopoly played a part in why the Sega Master System flopped as hard as it did in North America. To be clear, I don't think there was really ever any chance that the Sega Master System could have ever actually overtaken the NES in popularity in North America, and I certainly don't think the Atari 7800 was ever going to succeed anywhere, because, like, the Atari 7800 kind of fucking sucks. But if these rules weren't as strict, and publishers could have actually released big-name games like Mega Man, Castlevania, Final Fantasies, or others like them on competing hardware in one form or another, I feel like at least Sega could have given Nintendo a run for its money. But instead, these games for the most part remained under the strict custody of the Nintendo Entertainment System. The Sega Master System was by all accounts the more powerful game console, if you just compare two games for the platforms running side by side. By all accounts, Sega did have a reasonable shot at things, but the only two third-party publishers on the Sega Master System were Activision and Parker Brothers, and I don't think those deals worked out that well. And the 7800 was always gonna fail. Fuck this console. But alas, Nintendo was the uncontested champion of this console generation. Most console games in this era were released for the NES. However, many publishers were quite pissed off by Nintendo's monopolistic practices. As I said, publishers could only buy cartridges for their games from Nintendo, and those cartridges could be expensive. Price per cartridge would range from $9 to $14. And adjusting for inflation, this would equate to roughly $25 to $40 per cartridge. And you need to remember, Nintendo forced publishers to buy a minimum of 10,000 cartridges. Best case scenario, this would roughly cost the publishers an estimated $90,000, and that's in the year 1987. Adjust for inflation, this was around $250,000. Yeah, this is a pretty normal practice these days for consoles like the Switch too, but keep in mind, we're coming off the era of the Atari 2600, a platform where anyone could release a game for the platform without consulting Atari. So yeah, some publishers didn't want to go through all of that, and I think that's pretty fair. So many publishers would take a crack at trying to figure out how to release unlicensed NES games by trying to crack the lockout chip. Companies like Color Dreams and Camerica would get around this by sending a voltage spike to the lockout chip to temporarily disable it and allow unlicensed software to run. Whereas Atari Games, under the name Tengen, got around the lockout chip by, quite literally, lying to the United States government to obtain a copy of the lockout chip software. Needless to say, they were sued for this. But for the most part, while unlicensed games were actively circumventing Nintendo's lockout policies, these publishers weren't doing that much wrong. They'd make their games their way and release them however they wished. However, Nintendo was extremely irate that these companies were releasing games without bending over backwards to their monopolistic clauses. They decided to amp up their practices and cold call retailers to demand they stop selling stock of unlicensed games, or else they would immediately cease sending stock of official Nintendo products to their stores. Cause, you know, fair competition be damned, I suppose. This did majorly affect several publishers. However, some publishers did figure out ways around this. Camerica would sell their games at smaller retail chains, as well as Walmart and the Home Shopping Network, whereas Color Dreams shifted gears. Because they couldn't sell normal unlicensed games at typical stores, they just adjusted their demographic and started making religious video games that sell at Christian bookstores. And it's not like Nintendo really could have done anything to stop them. Nintendo didn't sell games at Christian bookstores. Shocker, I know. They had no leverage. So, Color Dreams rebranded to Wisdom Tree and carved out their own niche. Good for them, I guess. But regardless, despite everything, for most of the NES generation, Nintendo maintained their near monopoly. However, thankfully, Nintendo was basically forced to change their ways, as in 1989, Nintendo was investigated by the FTC. This led to Nintendo easing up on most of their restrictions in 1990, and thanks to Nintendo being forced to ease their restrictions, the competition actually started to gain some traction. The Sega Genesis, released in 1989, and actually started to give Nintendo a run for their money, and eventually even took over Nintendo's market share for a while. Which, you know, generally speaking, competition's a good thing. I see a lot of people in the retro gaming fandom, notably many on the older side who are elder millennials or Gen X, embellish how amazing the NES era was when talking shit on the current state of the games industry. And don't get me wrong, the current state of the games industry is fucking atrocious. However, don't act like there was never any problems in the game industry early on. And at the end of the day, Nintendo has always just been another greedy, soulless corporation. Nintendo just happens to also make games and hardware we actually like. Don't glamorize the state of the games industry back in the era of my non-existence. Things were shitty then too. The difference is that the industry was forced to change due to government intervention, unlike nowadays where the industry is debatably nearing another crash. So basically what I'm saying is nothing's changed.